Hello everyone, welcome to another one of the webinars that we organize here at the Zimbabwe and Kenya project, which is a Mellon-funded project based at Wits University. I'm Caio Araújo, a postdoctoral fellow at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research here at Wits. Over the last couple of years, I've been a grantee and a collaborator of the Governing Intimacies project, and I'm very happy to co-curate this webinar series with my colleague Sheila Roy, who is the lead investigator in the project. As many of you know, this year the series has been curated under the notion of Internet archives, interventions on gender, sexuality, and intimacy. If you have been following the series, you already know that we don't take the term archives literally or conventionally to mean, a repository of documents, but rather as an invitation to think about and interrogate our past, our present, and our futures. I also remind you, if you have not been following the series, that you can find our previous sessions in our YouTube channel. In today's session, we are very happy to welcome three colleagues who are going to speak about the politics of religion and sexuality in Africa. Religion has been an important component of queer politics in the continent. Over the last few years, research and activism around this topic have been on the rise, and have showed that the relationship between religion and queerness is not one-sided or unidimensional, but complicated, creative, and fraught with tension. So today we bring three scholars who are bridging the gap between religion research and queer African scholarship. They will be speaking about their projects in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. I'll briefly introduce the three speakers as we proceed with each presentation. If you have questions or comments, feel free to write them down using the Q&A session, the Q&A function here at the bottom of the page. We also ask those of you, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat. You can also type comments in the chat. We'll be collecting questions throughout the session, and we'll open the floor for debate after the three presentations. So let's start with Megan Robertson, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Desmond Tutu Chair in Religion and Social Justice, and she's also an associate lecturer and researcher in the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice in Cape Town. Welcome, Megan.
Thanks so much, Carl. I think Yurisha's going to share my presentation before I start. Here we go. So good evening, everyone, from my side. I've titled my presentation today, South Africa as a Queer Utopia, the Limits of the Myth in the Case of the Methodist Church of Southern Africa. Next slide. So today, I want to present my contribution to the field of religion and queer sexuality in Africa by discussing briefly some of the findings from my doctoral dissertation, which explored the experiences of queer clergy in the Methodist Church of Southern Africa, which I'm going to refer to from now on as the MCSA. In my research, I interviewed and observed 6 different participants who identified variously as queer and clergy in the MCSA. One of them was Ecclesia de Lange, a white lesbian woman who was excommunicated from the church over 10 years ago. And the 5 others who participated self-identified in the following ways. Bradley as a white queer man, Label as a black lesbian woman, Sam as a mixed race queer person who at different times identified and disidentified with the category of woman, and then Kagiso and Anele, who both identified as black gay men. Next slide. So in order to contribute to the theme of today's session, I want to discuss my work in relation to the discourse of a queer utopian South Africa. This discourse positions South Africa in relation to, and almost in opposition to, the wider context of Africa, which is viewed often problematically and homogeneously as queerphobic, culturally traditional, and religiously conservative. South Africa is instead presented as an outlier where queer justice and freedom prevails. It does not take much mental gymnastics, I think, to disrupt this discourse. The spate of killings of LGBTIQ plus people over the last few months throughout South Africa alone is evidence that this idea and this discourse is not based in the realities of people's lives. Therefore, what I'm interested in discussing today is not so much a disruption of this myth, but rather exploring the limitations and consequences of the perpetuation of this discourse within the context of religion. The three main points I will make in today's presentation is one, that the discourse of South Africa as a queer utopia relies heavily on a secular human rights ideology, in which religion is necessarily understood in opposition to queer rights, and thus is left uninterrogated. Second, this discourse centers the conversation around particular queer normative rights issues, especially same-sex marriage, thus muting, as a recent open letter to churches stated, wider discussions around violence, marginalization, and oppression of queer people. And third, it homogenizes queerness and flattens the intersectionality of queer experience, forgetting that a queer utopia is centered around a particular queer normative experience. Next slide, please. So first, let's discuss the queer utopian discourse's reliance on a secular human rights ideology. So when issues of religion and queer sexuality have been brought to the legal and public stage in South Africa, the courts have continuously reinforced the idea that the queer utopia is understood to exist outside of institutionalized religion. This happened when the MCSA, for example, when Ecclesia de Lange challenged the church on its decision to excommunicate her in the secular courts. The courts continuously urged her to seek arbitration within the bounds of the MCSA's own procedures. The MCSA and churches are therefore seen as operating outside of the parameters which allow claims towards a queer utopia and restricts the institutional positions to the realms of the religious, the theological, and the ecclesiological, spaces which it seems to suggest the queer utopian constitution of South Africa need not tread. Yet the history of South Africa demonstrates the integral role churches in the country have and continue to play on the political and public stage. With its previous presiding bishop serving as the president of the South African Council of Churches, its historical links to anti-apartheid stalwarts, including Stanley Makgoba, Peter Story, and Nelson Mandela, its comparatively large membership in South Africa, and its unofficial official role in the ANC chaplaincy, the MCSA in particular holds undeniable power in relation to public ethics. Thus, maintaining the myth that a queer utopian South Africa exists separately from institutionalized religion is to underestimate the church's role in limiting, shaping, and constituting queer freedoms in the country. This is especially important to note when we consider that narratives of queer phobia are primarily grounded in moral claims deriving from sexual ethics within religion and culture, driven and guided by institutionalized church bodies such as the MCSA. This stresses the importance of the sociological and anthropological understanding of church, religion, and sexuality. It reminds us that even if more transformative readings of scripture or more theologically accepting ideas of queer sexualities and non-normative genders are accepted by some theologians within the church, we must also consider the threat of division in a church, such as the MCSA, based on its position around queer sexuality, and the accompanying possibility of a loss of political and moral clout. This has implications for the political will of the MCSA to translate even more firming theologies into doctrines and public ideologies. Next slide, please. My second point is that the idea of South Africa as a site of queer freedom is largely based on the assumption that the legal battles won in South Africa around same-sex marriage somehow translates into queer liberation. In a recent open letter to churches titled Unmute Yourself, Reverend Klaas, Father Kadimeng, Mrs. Msenzane, and Reverend De Lange called out the church's silence in relation to the recent spate of murders of LGBT people. They write, "The least we expect from you, churches, is to be indiscriminate in exercising your pastoral ministry, prophetically denouncing the debasement of any human being, and not be disdainfully muted in relation to LGBTIQ plus people. I argue that the deafening silence of churches is partly as a result of the limited ways in which they have engaged with queer sexuality and the ways in which they have imagined possibilities of queer inclusion. The MCSA, like many other denominations in South Africa, have centered their debates around same-sex marriage. In fact, the debate in the MCSA is called the same-sex debate, implying that of central concern is not queer experiences, but rather same-sex relations. Even the excommunication of Ecclesia de Lange in 2010 was not a result of her identifying as a queer person, but rather because she expressed to her congregation that she wanted to enter into a same-sex marriage. Yet, despite the Church's central focus on same-sex marriage, the lived experiences of my participants were of course not confined in the same ways. So, for example, Anele claimed that he would never want to be married anyway, and was happy to be single or simply date or have casual or more serious sexual relations. Sam, on the other hand, is married. She does not have a legally constituted marriage, but she had a ceremony presided over by a Methodist bishop in which her and her life partner made a commitment to each other. The larger church and many other clergy and leadership also considers her to be married. Therefore, while Sam does continue to advocate for officially the official allowance of same-sex marriage in the church, the experience also shows that despite her bravery in declaring herself married, and despite little formal opposition from the church body, her negative experiences in the MCSA went beyond this. Specifically, she spoke about harrowing incidences of sexual violence perpetrated by bishops, clergy, and church members, as well as other more subtle forms of marginalization based on, for example, her gender non-conforming style of dress. I won't put a narrative up here because it contains vivid depictions of violence, and I don't feel I have enough time to create a trigger warning or do justice to a discussion about it. But the point I want to make is that while the MCSA continues to concern itself almost exclusively with same-sex marriage, broader issues impacting queer people's lives continue unabated. The MCSA has no formal position in relation to the hate crimes and hate speech bill, as do many other churches. The voicing of patriarchal and heteronormative views by its clergy go largely unchallenged by the institutional body, and the church has not come close to recognizing or interrogating the more informal, everyday ways in which it continues to promote and ordain heteronormativity through, for example, informal dress codes or its processes of training and placing ministers in churches. Therefore, even as an aspirational discourse, the notion of a queer utopia in South Africa, which is limited to certain rights issues such as same-sex marriage, restricts the way in which the church positions itself in relation to queer issues. And as pointed out in the Unmute Yourself letter, this has meant churches in South Africa have not done sufficient work in developing its political and theological tools in ways which might speak out against the violence and murders against queer people. The next slide, please. The final limitation of the queer utopian discourse is that even when these queer possibilities stretch into religious spaces, it often homogenizes queerness and flattens the intersectionality of queer experience. While the MCSA's official policies do not allow for the solemnization of same-sex marriage, as previous studies have shown, most notably by my fellow speaker today, Adrian Van Clinken, anti-queer doctrines and policies do not in itself preclude possibilities that queer people find and develop queer theologies and queer accepting spaces within those same churches. Participants in my study confirmed this. In fact, one of the more prevalent themes in my research was that a sort of queer subculture was prevalent in the MCSA. This subculture involved using church conventions and gatherings as, in inverted commas, promiscuous spaces for both heterosexual and queer sexual relationships. It also included the development of queer church language, which used choral metaphors to communicate about other men at denominational events. For example, Kagiso explained that they referred to bottoms or boys, in other words, more feminine men who are assumed to prefer to be penetrated in sexual acts as sopranos, and tops, more masculine men who are assumed to prefer to penetrate as altos. Based on some of these findings then, it might be easy to assume that a sort of mini queer utopia exists within the MCSA. Yet, while subversive in some ways, participants' narratives of the queer culture in the church also point to the patriarchal power relations which are perpetuated even within the seemingly subversive space. Kagiso, for example, maintained a strict delimitation of who he would sleep with and who he would not. He said, "Remember, I am a top, and if my partner is Methodist, they remain younger and I am dominant. At least I can still maintain the discipline there." Throughout participants' narratives, it seemed as though the queer space in the MCSA is predominantly for Black gay men and operates in ways which affirmed heteronormative and clerical systems of power. In fact, the possibilities of erotic spaces for queer women were not spoken about by the Black participants in my study, even when I explicitly asked them to consider it. And in the case of trans persons, that possibility was often openly dismissed in transphobic ways. What this finding shows is that the idea of a queer utopia is often subjective and operates within specific queer normative modes. While other scholars such as Zetu Matibeni have argued that queer activist spaces in South Africa presumes white cisgendered queerness as the norm, my research suggests that the queer spaces in the MCSA presumes Black gay queerness as the norm. So in conclusion, if queer possibilities in South Africa are to be imagined, this project must include a serious consideration of religion, not only in challenging religiously fueled queerphobic discourses, but also in terms of imagining a broader and more encompassing queer future. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan, for this very interesting presentation. We're gonna go directly to our second speaker. And I just want to remind the audience, if you have questions or comments, please write them down using the Q&A function. So now we are going to Adrian Van Clinken, who is a professor of religion and African studies at the University of Leeds, and is also an extraordinary professor at the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape. Welcome, Adrian. Adrian, I think you're muted.
Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. You would hope that by now we are all used to sharing screens and getting PowerPoints up, etc., but it's still a challenge. But thank you so much, Kayo, for introducing me and for inviting me to be part of this really exciting conversation. I'm really pleased to share this platform with Megan, my colleague in the Desmond Tutu Center, whose work I know quite well, and with Rafaela, the third speaker, whose work I only recently came across, actually. So it's wonderful to have this opportunity. The title of my talk is Pentecostal Spirit and the Queering of Queer Africa. And I ended up writing this talk over the past couple of days, loosely based on the work I have been doing in recent years in Kenya, which resulted in my book, Kenyan Christian Queer, but also further developing some of the ideas that came up in the writing of that book and in the aftermath. And I'd like to begin with a quotation from the Ugandan queer activist and scholar, Stella Nyanzi, who in her widely quoted essay, Queering Queer Africa, made a critical observation that much of the work in queer African studies begins with theories of Michel Foucault and Judith Butler. Rather than simply applying the Western queer canon to African contexts, she suggests that in order to queer the study of queer Africa, one must simultaneously reclaim Africa in its bold diversities and reinsert queerness. Now, interestingly, In this essay, she further points out that a good starting point for this process of reclaiming queer Africa might be the cultural and indigenous understandings of gendered spirits of ancestors who may possess individuals, since these offer socially appropriate notions of handling fluid, transient gender identities. Nyanzi's suggestion here is significant because it critically interrogates the largely secular underpinnings of Western queer theory, and she draws attention to the queer potential of African spiritual and religious traditions. The suggestion that queering queer Africa requires us to engage with spirits raises the question, what spirits allow for such a project? Nyanzi herself appears to be thinking of the ancestral spirits of indigenous religions. And indeed, there is a rich potential here that needs to be further explored. Yet in my own work on the religion and LGBTQ communities in Kenya and in other parts of Africa, I have noticed that at the grassroots level, many queer Africans are not particularly interested in reclaiming indigenous religions. Some of them are, but in my observation, it's not a large-scale movement. And of course, we can have a whole conversation about the reasons for that, but that's a topic for another conversation. In my observation in Kenya and in some other countries, many queer Africans are often engaged in Pentecostal charismatic forms of Christianity, more concerned with being filled with the Holy Spirit than with ancestral spirits. So the question then is, if the queering of queer Africa involves reclaiming Africa in its bold diversities, as Nyanzi suggests, can Pentecostal charismatic Christianity be part of this project? For many queer activists and thinkers, the answer to this question may be unequivocally negative. After all, Pentecostalism is one of the driving factors behind the politics of queerphobia across the continent. For many Pentecostal church leaders and their followers, LGBTQ rights are part of the devil's agenda of imposing Western secular values on Africa as a Christian continent. For them, same-sex attraction and gender variety are caused by demons that should be cast out, rather than by spirits that should be reclaimed. As the late Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina put it in an interview, what I don't like, and this is where my anger comes from, what I don't like is how public space has been squashed by Pentecostal demon hunters. Subsequently, after his coming out as gay, Wainaina engaged in a mission of fighting Pentecostal-inspired homophobia. Queering queer Africa, or in his words, freeing the African imagination, for him required the continent to be delivered from the spirit of Pentecostalism. However, around the same time, when Wainaina engaged in a mission of fighting Pentecostalism, a group of LGBTQ people of faith started the first queer-affirming church in Kenya. Founded in 2013, Cosmopolitan Affirming Community has become an important hub of Christian LGBTQ activism in East Africa. Interestingly, the way in which this community expresses the Christian faith is unmistakably influenced by Pentecostal styles of worship and theology. CAC is featured in the documentary film Kenyan Christian Queer that I produced last year with the documentary filmmaker Iwan Obinyan and the Kenyan activist David Ochar. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to watch the full documentary right now. I'd love to have an opportunity to do that, maybe at a later stage. But I would like to watch the trailer of the film, which is just 1 minute long, to give you a very short impression of the film and of CAC in particular. So give me a second to share my other screen.
When they realized that I'm that queer preacher, they refused me, threatened that I may take their wives, but I'm not that kind of person. I love the gospel, I have the call, I never remain in comfort zones.
Say, precious Jesus, I reject homosexuality today.
I had internalized the fact that I was actually a sinner.
Sexual activity between people of the same sex is destructive.
The bounty was put on our heads, so a lot of us left the country.
People harassed me the way I was so girly.
Those who are still in Kenya live in constant fear every day.
We decided, okay, can we have our own little fellowship?
The first day I went to CSA, I felt the kind of love that I've never gotten in church.
Do you ignore texts that you're not comfortable with?
At CSC, we take the Bible very seriously, but we just don't take it literally.
I thank God for whom I am.
Prayer is where you will find direction.
Mwende Mungu, hivyo madongodhanyo ulivyo. Na ikisindikana kaa kama mimi, utafurahia. Unafaa.
I am actually gay because God made me this way. God is the architect of my gay.
Perhaps the most remarkable character in the film is prophetess Jacinta. Like many other Pentecostal charismatic prophets in Kenya, Jacinta preaches the gospel on matatus, Kenya's crowded minibuses, and on Nairobi city squares. So in Wainaina's words, she might exemplify the Pentecostal tendency to suppress and to squash public space. Yet Jacinta also openly identifies as lesbian. She has spoken about this on national TV and radio, as well as in the documentary film. As a self-declared lesbian prophetess, she is possessed, so to say, by two spirits, the spirit of lesbianism and the Holy Spirit. But for her, these spirits are not separate, but intertwined, because she believes that fundamentally God created her lesbian, the same God whose spirit has called her into prophetic ministry. Jacinta might be unique. I have not encountered any other openly identifying LGBTQ prophet in Kenya. Yet the way in which she combines a radical Pentecostal Christian spirituality with a proud affirmation of same-sex desire is far from unique. Many members of CAC and many LGBTQ Christians in Kenya and in other parts of Africa find ways of bringing these two parts of their lives together, sometimes negotiating tensions creatively, sometimes integrating them smoothly. The African-American bishop, Joseph Tolton, who is also featured in the film, and who is a spiritual lead mentor of CAC, explained to me that the success of his LGBTQ affirming ministry in East Africa is located in what he called his anointing, a term referring to the Pentecostal experience of being called by and filled with the Holy Spirit. He said that his anointing was recognized by African Pentecostal pastors and believers, who therefore were much more likely to listen to him and take his inclusive gospel seriously than that they would listen to a secular Western LGBTQ activist. Now, I don't want to romanticize Pentecostalism. I'm very much aware of the problematic ways in which this highly popular form of Christianity is reshaping public culture across the African continent and is imposing an often rather conservative body politic. And in the film, we included fragments of Prophet Awuor, who is a very popular Kenyan charismatic preacher who is openly campaigning and prophesying against the spirits of homosexuality. So there is a lot to say that kind of problematizes Pentecostalism. Yet we also know that Pentecostalism is a highly dynamic, diverse, heterogeneous, and unstable religious movement. There is no unified structure of religious authority, and it is far more concerned with orthopraxis than with orthodoxy. This creates considerable room for religious agency, creativity, and innovation, a space that can be, and in fact already is, utilized for the emergence of queer-affirming expressions and articulations. The African-American theologian Ashton Crawley speaks about Black Pentecostal breath as a fundamentally queer spirit, opening up new possibilities and imaginations in the Black church in the US. To paraphrase his argument, and to expand on Nyanzi's suggestion with which I started, I wonder whether we could also speak of an African Pentecostal breath, a Pentecostal spirit that allows for queer world-making in Africa. This spirit, which in Christian parlance is the Holy Spirit, enables the emergence of a lesbian prophetess, such as Jacinta, of inclusive Christian communities, such as CIC, and of affirming ministries such as the one led by Joseph Tolton. This spirit may offer the socially appropriate notions of handling fluid, transient gender and sexual identities that are so much needed in the context of a deeply Pentecostalized African Christian landscape.
Thank you, Adrian, for another very, very exciting talk. And now we're going to go to our third speaker, Rafaela Taylor-Seymour, who is a UK-US Fulbright scholar and a PhD candidate at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Chicago. Welcome, Rafaela.
Thank you so much. This has been just wonderful to see Megan and Adrian's presentations, and thank you so much to Kayo and Srila for organizing this. I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm just going to speak, although I do have a couple of images that illustrate a few of the things I talk about in my paper that I'm happy to share later. So my paper is entitled Negotiating Queerness and Ancestors in Contemporary Zimbabwe, so it's nicely in dialogue, I think, with Adrian's paper. Recently, I saw someone ask this question on Twitter, Awande says. They were like, why is it that a lot of queer and gender non-conforming people are into African spirituality? Awande and I are discussing a theme that recurred frequently during my fieldwork in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe's second city, about the relationship between queerness and ancestors. In this paper, I use the term queerness to refer to perceptions of gender and sexual transgression. Over the past 9 years, I've worked with queer rights organizations in Bulawayo, focusing on the intersection between queer life and spirituality. Since then, questions about ancestors have become increasingly central to my research. This is because more and more young queer people have come to participate in the broad nexus of spiritual practices involving ancestors that I refer to as ancestral spirituality. Among people embedded in queer networks in Southern Africa, the notion that there's a relationship between queerness and ancestors is often visible. Perhaps the most high-profile work that highlights this connection is Nkunzi Nkabende's memoir, Black Bull, Ancestors and Me, in which Nkabende describes their vocation as a lesbian sangoma. This connection has also been noted in academic articles, many of which cite Nkabende's book, including that of my co-panelist, Adrian Van Clinken, in his work with Kwame Otu. Moreover, this phenomenon is evident beyond South Africa. For instance, in the collection of poems by Zimbabwean author Tsitsi Jaji, Beating the Graves, in which Jaji narrates the story of a genderqueer ancestor, or in the paintings of Zimbabwean artist Cynthia Chamisa, which depict the gender fluidity of sangomas. In this paper, I explore two contrasting answers to the question of the relationship between queerness and ancestors. For the purposes of today, I set aside explanations that come from those who view either queerness or ancestral spirituality in negative terms. Since the early colonial era, both queerness and ancestral spirits have often been characterized as unchristian or demonic, and I explore the associations of those histories elsewhere in my work. But here I focus on a generational divide among those who offer positive accounts for the connection between queerness and ancestral spirits. The contrast in explanations provided by older traditionalists and young queer people, I suggest, demonstrates how young people in Zimbabwe are untethering ancestral spirituality from the authority of elders, In turn, their uptake of ancestral spirituality allows for the forging of new kinds of intimate relationships with ancestral spirits that are particularly meaningful for queer people. In debates about the so-called Africanness of same-sex intimacies, it's often assumed that elders, perhaps most notably leaders like Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe, straightforwardly deny the presence of queer and gender non-conforming people in their societies. But the prominence of voices like those of Mugabe obscures a heterogeneity of opinion among older Zimbabweans. Many elders suggest that ancestors were in fact central to pre-colonial understandings of gender and sexual transgression. From this perspective, queerness is explained by the presence of powerful ancestral spirits, known as Amatlozi in Ndebele and Vadzimu in Shona. Owande recalls an experience in which an older man invoked this idea. One time I was on my way to see a friend and I heard this old guy on the street mutter, "I'm seeing an old man in this one, that's who's leading her." And the guy he's with nods and agrees. They see this queerness in me, walking kind of like a man, and that's how they explain it, that a grandfather spirit is leading me. Here, elders explain Owande's queerness by referencing the profound ways in which ancestral spirits can influence their hosts' lives, affecting their personality, mannerisms, and even their experience of themselves. For these reasons, older traditional practitioners sometimes attribute queerness to the dominance of one or more ancestral spirits of the opposite gender. Indeed, in their memoir, Nkabinde describes their own gender transgression through this lens. While these accounts ostensibly make room for queer people in Zimbabwe's past and present, however, young queer people in Bulawayo almost universally reject them. In particular, they strongly oppose the notion that there's a causal relationship between the presence of ancestral spirits and sexuality or gender expression. While scholars have critiqued the LGBT framework as a foreign imposition, my interlocutors generally find terms like lesbian, gay, and queer attractive because they frame gender and sexuality as innate and unchangeable. Elders' accounts, on the other hand, suggest that queerness can, and in many cases should, be fixed, usually through consultations with established sangomas. Many queer people have experienced attempts to alter their queerness in traditional contexts, commonly through efforts to coax ancestral spirits into an arrangement perceived to be less disruptive to their host's life. These efforts are often both physically and emotionally grueling, and many queer people say that they ultimately affirm their sense that their desires and identities are pre-given and not alterable. Nevertheless, as Owande's words suggest, many young queer Zimbabweans find ancestral spirituality intriguing. Owande is 29 years old and considers themselves queer and non-binary, using the English language pronoun they. Over the past few years, they have begun to grapple with the question of the relationship between queerness and ancestors. Among scholars, the predominant explanation is young queer people's desire to declare belonging through traditional practices and to speak back to assertions that queerness is inherently un-African. In a recent edited volume of GLQ, for instance, Kirk Firak, Neville Hode, and Danai Mupotsa developed the lens of the queer customary to describe forms of queerness that engage with African histories. Likewise, in the work of Xavier Livermore and Ngubani Ambela, they refer to usable traditions that allow queer people to both claim sexual autonomy and redefine understandings of African tradition. While some of my interlocutors are interested in elders' accounts of queerness, for most, abstract ideas about tradition are remote. Instead, I suggest paying attention to the ways in which young queer people are reinventing ancestral spirituality reveals that its attraction lies in the types of relationships they forge with spirits. Among elders, ancestral spirituality is markedly gerontocratic, with older people playing an important role in determining the presence of ancestral spirits and the meaning of their advice. For young queer people, in contrast, elders' understandings are increasingly giving way to a more individualized approach. Owande, for instance, is learning about ancestral spirits entirely apart from their family. Their primary source of information is other young queer people and social media platforms like Twitter and YouTube, which they see as more reliable than elders, whose opinions they worry are clouded by prejudice. In this sense, young people are not only departing from elders' understandings of queerness, but also questioning their spiritual authority. Ancestral spirits are coming to play a central role in affirming young queer people's sense of who they are. in contrast to the tense and often painful experiences they have with living kin. Ancestral spirits promise unequivocal acceptance. Ancestors choose a host from among the wide range of living people, and they choose people who will set aside their own desires in order to tend to the wishes of their spirit. Moreover, ancestors have the ability to see things that are hidden and know people's secrets. Indeed, some of my interlocutors note that ancestral spirits are the only people they never had to come out to, because they already knew about their sexuality. Furthermore, ancestors make it known if they disapprove of any aspect of their host's lives. In Awande's words, "I'm yet to find a queer person who says, my ancestors revealed to me that they're against my sexual orientation." Unlike with the living, Awande explains, that quality of being accepted as you are makes it easier to want to connect with your ancestors. In this account, then, ancestors foreclose the possibility of altering queerness and emphasize it as a central and valuable aspect of a person's being. This sense of affirmation is accompanied by guidance and healing. Once they've chosen their host, ancestral spirits protect and guide that person, steering them away from dangerous situations and people. Indeed, some young people reflect this understanding by translating Amatlozi into English as guide or angel. As they nurture these relationships over many years, young queer people turn to ancestors to help them make difficult choices about family, friends, and relationships. It emboldens me, Awande explains. My ancestors love me the way I am. If somebody is going to have a problem with me, my ancestors will deal with them. It's comforting and it helps me get through the hardships I've experienced. As such, many young queer people describe the process of building relationships with ancestral spirits as a form of healing from past wounds. Young queer people's engagement with ancestral spirituality undeniably raises questions about tradition, and at least implies a search for customary or African forms of queerness. But for many, its appeal is not as an epistemic framework through which to make sense of queerness. Instead, it is fundamentally grounded in lived experience, reflecting young queer people's desires for strong and enduring relationships and the promise of healing and support that ancestral spirits offer. Dynamics in their relationships with family, both distance from living relatives and acceptance by spirits, are central to their interest in ancestral spirituality. As they untether the institution from the authority of elders, they increasingly speak directly with ancestral spirits without the assistance of older family members. In return, ancestral spirits offer companionship, guidance, and intimacy in a world in which young queer people often feel they lack those very things from their closest living relatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rafaela, for closing the panel with such an exciting talk. Now, just before we open the floor to the audience's questions, I just want to give the speakers the opportunity to respond to each other if you wish, if you have comments or questions to each other. So anyone wants to go first, or?
I actually did have a question that's really to both Megan and Adrian. I noticed you both, I loved both of your talks, and I think that all of our papers are in conversation in a really wonderful way. I noticed you both talking, I think Megan used the phrase like transformative readings of scripture and affirmative theologies, and Adrian used the phrase inclusive gospel. And I was just curious to hear a bit more about the kinds of reading, like what parts of scripture people are going to, and yeah, I would just be curious to hear more about that.
Do you want to respond, or do you also want to pose questions, Adrian and Megan?
I can briefly respond to the question.
Yes.
Yeah, so the term inclusive gospel is the kind of language that in the community of CAC and by the organization of Tolton is explicitly used. So they are explicitly on a mission in their own kind of discourse of promoting an inclusive gospel. And interestingly, for Joseph Tolton, who is an African-American and who leads an African-American organization, they frame their work of promoting this inclusive gospel explicitly in opposition to what they call conservative white evangelicalism and its agenda of homophobia. So there's a really interesting kind of racial dynamic there about a Black inclusive gospel versus a white conservative gospel. And it relates, of course, to the whole question of how the culture wars have been exported, American culture wars have been exported and play out in African context around issues of religion and sexuality. I mean, there's much to say about how exactly they understand this kind of inclusive gospel, but basically it is about, I mean, they refer to, I mean, a kind of an inclusive notion of every human being belonging to the household of God, every human being being a child of God, every human being being created by God, being created in the image of God, Jesus Christ, including people, especially the marginalized in his ministry, etc. So it's these kind of biblical notions that are kind of foundational to what they call this inclusive gospel.
So for me, so I'm not a theologian myself. And so I think in some of Adrian's earlier work and more recent work, I think he goes into a bit more detail than I do about, you know, actual queer theologies. But what I was also interested in with my participants is how they used, like Adrian was saying, certain concepts, religious concepts. So for example, koinonia, if I'm saying that correctly. And the, you know, certain ideas of love and of Methodism, I suppose, and mission in Methodism, to make the argument that there are queer spaces in the church. But as well as the kind of theologies behind that, I was also interested in the ways in which they not only created queer theologies, but queer religiosities, so the ways in which they lived out kind of their queerness, and especially their clerical identity in queer ways in the church, and how that functioned. And although they were often supported, I suppose, by certain queer theological concepts, it was more embodied than simply an abstract theology that they communicated to me. So yeah.
Right, if there are no comments or questions from the panel, we could open the floor to questions from the audience. But before that, I just have two quick questions that I want to, you know, I want to abuse my role here as a moderator to put perhaps. I have a question for Megan. I really do appreciate your project of kind of challenging the idea of South Africa as a queer utopia. And I was wondering that one of the ways in which this has been done quite successfully is to point to the precarious positions of queer refugees and migrants in South Africa. Obviously, from the point of view of this group, South Africa is not a queer utopia. And I wonder if that is something that surfaced in your research at all. I don't know if these churches who are their public, so to speak. So this is something that, I mean, I'm just curious to know if there has been any engagement with migrancy or with refugees in these churches. And then I have a question for Rafaela. What you said about ancestral spirits working as a kind of, or rather the idea of queerness in relation to ancestral spirits working against the claim that homosexuality is an African. It was so interesting to me. And I just wanted to ask, because in our previous webinar, we had a talk about the idea of the queer archive and how in many spaces in the continent, the archive is supposed to play this role, right? To provide a sense of Africanness to queer experiences in the continent. But then what you're suggesting is almost as if these ancestral spirits, they could offer an alternative to the secular queer archive. And I would be very, very interested if you could expand on this idea, perhaps. And I don't know if you want to answer, or if we can collect other questions from the audience. Yes, Shrila, do you want to?
Sure. Just to say, my internet, I'm getting those flashes which says your internet connection is unstable. So obviously, feel free to see the questions yourself in case you can't, if I don't come across. So there are a couple of more empirical questions, but I think they speak for all of us, especially the first one, which asks, how can we watch the full documentary? Adrian. So if you could maybe give us some clue, just post a link or if that's not available, whatever might work. There was also, I think, another question in the same vein that I can't find it now, which was asking for some book references. Where did that go? Did you see that, Rafaela? Was that directed to you? Maybe you could also just throw in a... Oh, that's why it's gone. Oh, well done. Thank you. Okay, so coming, to a more substantial question, which is to you, Adrian. It's asking about the lesbian prophetess, and more generally, what's your experience with queer people? And I guess this is one of those questions that kind of recur, right? Do people use the Western labels of LGBT, and if not, why not? Oh yes, and another empirical question, I'll just end this round with that, and hopefully we'll do another round. Rafaela, about the organizations that you've worked with in Bulawayo. Okay, super, thank you.
Yeah, so just to briefly respond to the question of terminology, right? In my observation in Kenya, the acronyms of the LGBTQ acronyms are kind of widely adopted, are embraced, are used for people to identify themselves, to articulate their experiences, their desire, etc. But at the same time doing so, often the tensions of the suitability of this framework kind of play up. So in my book, Kenyan Christian Queer, I have a chapter where I analyze the life stories of LGBTQ Kenyans that were documented and published in an archive, in an archiving project called Stories of Our Lives. And many of the people telling their stories in that volume, they begin the story with a very firm statement of identity. I am a 24 years old gay man from whatever. But then as the story unfolds, in the next paragraph, they suddenly refer to themselves as transgender or as bisexual or as... And in many of these stories, people kind of are struggling to identify themselves with this terminology. So they use it, and we can talk about the reasons why they do so. But then at the same time, the terminology doesn't really work, is not appropriate, isn't adequate to capture the way in which they actually understand their own sexuality and gender experience. And one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is the kind of emergence of an alternative discourse, which is not simply kind of reclaiming indigenous concepts of gender and sexuality, but combining Western and indigenous or African knowledges of sexuality. So both the term lesbian prophetess and the term lesbian sangoma that Rafaela used to in her paper are really interesting in that regard, because they use the kind of Western label of lesbian, combining it with terminology that makes sense in local, cultural, and religious context, a sangoma, a prophetess, etc. And I'm really intrigued by this kind of invention of a terminology, of a discourse that makes sense in these local contexts, which is hybrid, which is entangled, because it makes use of a globalized, originally Western kind of discourse of LGBTQ identities, but at the same time combining it with a local discourse framework. There's much more to say about that, but just observing kind of that emergence, which I think is really significant.
And about the documentary?
Yeah, sorry, I was just writing my answer in the chat, so I'll finish that. But
Yeah, I can answer Kairo's question. Yeah, I thank you. That's also actually very helpful for me to start to think about like the kind of analytic of archive. I think, yeah, I would say definitely, because I think especially, I mean, especially African archives that are like, it's, you know, when you go back 100 years, they're so heavily colonial, they're written by white men. And so there's, I mean, the gaps in the archive are just vast, you know, they're like vastly distorted of like the kind of true representations of what was happening at those times. And I think it is interesting. I guess I would just nuance it to think of like archives as multivocal, you know, and to think about the ways what I'm trying to do through my research as well is not to flatten the picture and kind of tell a one-dimensional story, and to kind of try to reflect the sort of debates that are happening, and that there are people, you know, with this paper, I don't want to give the impression that everyone in Bulawayo is doing this, but there is like enough to say that there's a movement. There definitely is, and I think that was a phenomenon that really struck me during my research. And I think ancestral spirits are also, my project tries to take ancestral spirits as like social actors, because I think, and in that way, like they are just as complex as living people, you know, they have personalities and names and characteristics and all of those things. So I think the archive of voices of ancestral spirits will be just as diverse and include as much debate as any archive and, you know, living culture does. And I think, but I do think it's a place, like I work in rural Matabeleland sometimes, and I really see a diversity of opinion from elders as well, and don't want to like flatten it as either generation as having one voice. Yeah.
And then for your question about the migrancy, so just in my review also of the literature, I find that in sociological and anthropological studies of queerness in Southern Africa, there is focus on migrancy, but as soon as you kind of add the lens of religion, specifically Christianity, there's almost no discourse around that in the literature at the moment, including in, you know, my work. And what I find that the scholars, including myself, has focused on a lot is not why people move, but why people stay. So why do you stay within a religious institution, in my case, or in a country which either being queer in some way is illegal, or your legal rights are confined in some way, for example, in the church. And so the answers to that are vast, depending on what context you're looking in. I can speak a little bit about that if someone is interested, but that is really where I find, and theories of boundary making. In my own work, I use Thomas Tweed's theory of crossing and dwelling and homemaking to make sense of how people not necessarily only negotiate their belonging and create spaces of belonging in the church, but also just how they already claim their belonging without having to be very subversive. Even though their queer sexuality might put them on the margins of that institution, in other ways they are in the center, either because of race or gender or their clerical kind of position. So, yeah.
Okay, I'll just move to the three quite more substantive questions. Francisco, I hope I do justice to your question. Francisco cites a book by a Spanish anthropologist, which the title is there, and I'm not going to read it out in my terrible Spanish. And he writes in the book, he shows how common it is in many cultures worldwide that LGBT people are conducted by their societies to the sacerdotal work. So does that mean that they become priests? Well, you probably understand the implication of the question better than I do. He presented some native reasons why, but he didn't offer a general explanation. Would you risk any explanation? That's very interesting. Okay, so that's question one. The second question is from Sarojini, who is asking, very interesting again, that a lot of the presentation suggests that religion in Africa is not as queerphobic as one might assume, whether it's the Methodist Church, Pentecostal movement, African religion more broadly. The emerging evidence is begging for fresh theorization of what's actually going on as opposed to previous research. What framings might help us in aid of these fresh theorizations? Decolonial theories might be too obvious or might just be the ones that we need to move towards. Okay, the other question has been answered. And finally, a question from Chet, who's asking about the connections between religious institutions and the state, in particular, the colonial state, which codified customary laws tapered to suit colonial norms, and so on and so forth. These were largely embraced by post-colonial states because it suited the new dispensation. Would this suggest that there's a common thread which connects all religious denominations and the state within dialogues around queerness in Africa? So a really good question, I think, bringing in the state. Thank you so much for all of your questions. Okay, who would like to risk an explanation as Francisco provoked?
I can give it a try, but it's just a try, or some very basic thoughts. But basically, the question reminds me of Mary Douglas' work, Purity and Danger, which is of course a key anthropological text. Which basically, I mean, I'm not doing justice to the complexity of the text, but basically, it's about how practices and things that are associated with taboo at the same time often have a sacred dimension, and I think that's where part of the key of thinking around this complexity is, that queer sexuality is taboo, is stigmatized, but perhaps for that reason exactly, it can also, in certain circumstances, can be attached with sacred significance. And of course, in particular context, it works out in different ways, but I think this paradox of purity and danger is a really kind of productive lens of thinking around this question.
Yeah, I would really echo that. I think that's a really healthy of just how boundaries that are crossed are also often kind of, yeah, either dangerous, but also productive, and are kind of, especially like often become sites of potent spiritual force, I think. And another thing I noticed, I'm actually teaching at the moment like this kind of comparative class on gender, sexuality and spirituality. And it tends to be more in like non-textual traditions, so kind of indigenous traditions. It's very common for shamanic type roles to be gender queer roles, we could say. Yeah, so, but it's definitely, it is a phenomenon that is really widely noted pretty much everywhere in the world. You do see a version of it, yeah.
Would you like to go ahead and respond to the other questions, or we can move to Megan and come back?
Please, Megan, go.
Okay. So maybe the question around the decolonial theories. Are we moving on to the next question? Is that what we're doing? Okay. So for me, I think I don't have an answer to that. I mean, decolonial seems to be kind of the buzzword and what we all seem to gravitate to when we're trying to, I suppose, Africanize a theory or concept. But I think that's something I'm still trying to grapple with, especially around the concept of activism and agency, and looking at how queer activism has been imagined kind of in Western ways, outside of, kind of in secular ways, right? So outside of religious spaces. And then in my own research, it was really difficult to take that conceptualization of activism and then just place it as a framework to understand what my participants were doing, because it didn't look the same. And so I do find that, post-colonial imaginings of queer activism or religious activism was really helpful in helping me to imagine what queer agency looks like in Africa. And so I think it is a bigger project of imagining or reimagining what queer theory means within the context, in my research of South Africa, but more broadly of Africa. And does it stay queer theory, or does it become something else? And can we simply put decolonial in front of that and say there's now a decolonial queer theory? And I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a project that I think all three of us are participating in, and hopefully building something out of that. yeah, that's the answer to that question.
I can try and add my 5 cents, but please give us a couple of years, and Megan and Rafaela, and possibly I, will be a step farther in theorizing things. But I mean, definitely decolonial thought is offering a rich kind of potential, I think. But at the same time, in much of post-colonial and decolonial theorizing, there seems to be a difficulty of engaging with religion as well, in my observation. Of course, there are exceptions, but part of the potential, I think, is in the decolonial notion of plurality of knowledges, the pluriversity, and those kind of notions that allow for multiple epistemologies, and that allow for thinking beyond kind of Western secular frameworks. But in addition to kind of decolonial theory, I think there's an enormous potential for African queer studies and theorizing to engage with the Black Atlantic and with theories that have been developed from the African diaspora. And I'm thinking here of womanist thinking, Black feminist thinking, which has a very rich history of engaging with spirituality and religion much more than white Western European kind of feminist thinking. So the whole intersections of the body, of sexuality, of spirituality has been a theme in womanist and Black feminist thought for decades. And I'm really hoping that in the coming years, there will be a conversation between the African continent and the African diaspora in terms of theorizing what it means, kind of theorizing queer African or Pan-African identities from queer perspectives.
Would anyone like to answer the question about the relationship between religious institutions and the state? I think that's a quite interesting question, but at the same time very complex. I don't know if anyone would have thoughts on that.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's complicated. I think within that question, though, there is a lot of, as much as we say religious institutions, especially if we're looking at South Africa, we can't excuse Christianity, right? So, I mean, we use religion, but the assumption is that in South Africa's case, colonialism is indelibly linked to Christianity rather than just religion more generally. And so I think the link between Christianity, the way that sexual ethics has developed and become legalized during apartheid, but also how queer activism has then developed in relation to that, is all kind of infused with Christian normative ethics in some ways. And I think I don't have an answer to maybe that broad question specifically, but I have written an article recently where I do start to interrogate the role that Christianity has played in queer politics in South Africa, and how it has kind of not been interrogated enough in the ways that queer activism has been developed in relation to those queer ethics. So, for example, I do argue that as Dr. Mativeni has argued, that pride politics in South Africa are shaped around a white, like I've said in my presentation, a white cisgender queer as norm, right? But what it hasn't, that activism hasn't done, is engaged with the kind of Christian moral political correctness that backs up that pride politics. And so I do suggest that as much as Christianity needs to, or as much as scholarship needs to question queer, sorry, I'm talking nonsense now today, but as much as scholarship needs to question the ways in which sexual ethics has been framed by Christianity, it also needs to question the ways in which queer activism is still kind of linked to that Christianity and hasn't quite unbound itself from that colonial kind of past. And so it's for me, I can't say that all religious denominations throughout Africa are connected. They also operate quite separately in a lot of ways. So the Methodist Church of Southern Africa doesn't operate in the same ways as a church in Kenya might, or even in the different countries in Southern Africa because of the state laws. So I can't exactly say that there's a common thread that connects all religious denominations. What I do know is that in South Africa, a lot of the mainline churches have adopted similar stances because of their similar history in relation to apartheid and anti-apartheid activism. So yeah.
Great. No, Megan, I think that was really productive. Thank you. So I'm just going to, before we completely run out of time, get the last two questions in, which may or may not relate. So feel free to respond or not. One is asking about the connections of your work with West Africa and North Africa, thinking of constructions of God as both male and female, ancestral spirits as male and female. So interestingly, I suppose trying to complicate, gender and the divine. And then the other question by the same person is asking about queer voices of protest uncovered during the colonial period. So I don't know whether that fits within your remit. And I just also wanted to, abuse my power and just throw in something around. I mean, particularly, I think what Megan was talking about. I mean, so much of which, we've seen, when we see everywhere, and certainly I've seen in work around queer feminist activism in India, which is the reproduction of normativity in spaces that are meant to undo it, for instance, right? Like queer politics, whatever. But I was just thinking more broadly, if all of your work contributes to, this kind of long debate, but maybe it's been resurrected a little bit around provincializing queer theories, anti-normative stance. I don't know if any of you all saw that, a quite recent book on queer Korea, right? And there's a whole surge around writers in East Asia who are trying to think about, well, what is this attachment to normativity? And well, we have, a queerness flourishing in spaces of family, which have been rejected by the Edelmans, that kind of stuff. And I suppose for me, it's always this question of yes, but then how do we grapple? And I think, Megan, that's why I think that tension is very much present in your presentation, but then how do we grapple with the sexual violence? How do we do you know what I mean? I feel like we don't want to romanticize the family or religion. And I think for me, when I look at queer women, it's particularly complicated because they're so vulnerable to these institutions, right? So we don't want to romanticize in a way of saying like, oh, we're rejecting anti-normativity, but at the same time, obviously, we want to recognize that anti-normativity is very essentialist. Anyway.
Let's give Rafaela the chance to respond because we know that she has to leave us soon. So, yes.
Yeah, I'll just quickly respond to Bright Alosi's question. And I think that in West Africa, the work of like Oyaronke Oyewumi and Ifi Amadume has been really powerful in kind of deconstructing gender and sexuality as categories and kind of reimagining how the body and its kind of meaning is symbolized and experienced in different contexts. I guess my sense is that in Southern Africa, less work. I mean, there is some, like Marka Prex Hungochani, like looks at this a bit in Zimbabwe. I sense that there's like less work done in Southern Africa. And also in my work, I definitely draw on these kinds of theories from West Africa, but also I want to kind of think about like not flatten African experience and to try and show like a diversity within it as well, and to kind of situate specific histories, especially in Southern and East Africa. I think with settler colonialism, those histories are also different and shape contemporary experiences of gender and sexuality as well. Yeah, I have to run. I'm so sorry, but thank you so much for this class.
Thank you so much, Rafaela. Now, other speakers, do you want to respond to the last round of questions?
Just a brief response to Bright Alosi's question about the West African focus context. I mean, Rafaela just mentioned some of the classics in West African gender studies, right? And I've been surprised actually by how little engagement there has been in recent queer studies, African queer studies, with these kind of classics in gender studies. Because I think that a text like The Invention of Women by Oyewumi has a rich potential for queer thinking. but for some reason they seem to be different fields or different discourses. More recently, I've been intrigued by literary production, especially from West Africa. And so I'm thinking here of novels such as Under the Udala Trees by Chinolo Akbaranta, Freshwater by Agwege Emezi, which are deeply rooted in local cultural and religious cosmologies and contexts, and that allow for thinking around gender and sexuality and embodiment in ways that help us to go beyond kind of rigid notions of LGBTQ identities. And it relates to a broader question, what the potential is for creative writing and arts for queer production in African contexts. Anyway, so that's just a few comments on that question. And Shrila, your question about anti-normativity is a fascinating one, and it's obviously a very complex one. But one of the things that struck me in the three presentations is that, and I think Rafaela mentioned it most explicitly, but it seemed relevant in Megan's presentation and mine as well, is the notion of individuality, that for the kind of queer religious hybrid identities and phenomena that each of us were talking about, for those phenomena to emerge, in each of the three papers, there seemed to be a certain level of individuality that allowed those subjects to kind of develop and invent these identities in ways that are normative and anti-normative at the same time, because people subscribe to local cosmologies, they adopt the language, the norms, that the discourse that makes sense in their context, but at the same time pushing the boundaries of these categories of the language, etc., of the institutional boundaries in Megan's case. So I think this whole question of normativity versus anti-normativity also has to do with the question of individuality versus community, and the way in which queer subjects navigate that tension.
And maybe just to add, so for me, Shrila, your question also kind of brings us back to what does queer mean within particular context. And I actually haven't read that book that you suggested, so I'm interested to go find it. But precisely what you were saying, and I think at least scholarship and in my own work, I found within the institution, we seem to take for granted that we know what a queer future would look like. And so we all take for granted that we know what we're moving towards. And so then when a concept like, in my work, promiscuity comes up and it seems quite subversive and it seems quite queer, it would be easy to jump on that and then say that that would take us to a queer future. But then, like you said, then you have this tension of, well, in a lot of ways, that very concept that we think is queer and subversive is also operating in very normative ways and can be used in very harmful ways by certain people, right? And does still exclude certain performativities or expressions of queer and what other queer people might imagine. So, like I said, some of the Black gay men in my study imagined a queer future. Well, actually, they were kind of living in their queer future already. They felt already accepted. They didn't want to get married, so it was fine, regardless of what the church decided they already belonged, right? And in a lot of ways, they held a lot of power because they also performed their identity as clergy very well, right? In very authentic ways in terms of the church's understanding of what a minister should look like and should be. So their queer future looks very different, for example, from some of the queer Black women ministers in my study, who their queer future was outside of the realms of possibility almost. And so I think your question does bring us back to, so how do we study queerness without kind of individualizing it so much that it means something different for each person, and where we can't make conclusions about it, but then at the same time trying to imagine queer possibilities. Yeah, so it is that tension.
Thank you so much. And I think with this excellent response, we are gonna conclude the session. I really want to thank all participants for joining us. I really want to thank the audience who endured. We are 25 minutes beyond our time, and thank you so much for being here. And I also want to remind everyone that our next session is going to take place on May 25th, and it will be on the topic of right-wing gender politics in the Global South. So you'll be seeing the publicity for that soon on our Facebook account and also on our website. Once again, thank you, everyone. Thank you, all participants.
Thank you so much. So lovely to meet both of you. Well, all three of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us. That was a fascinating conversation, I think.
Really was. Yeah, thank you. I learned a lot. So I'm really looking forward to dip into more of your work, both of you. Okay, yes. Bye everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.